if exercise was being sold as a pill, it would be hailed as a wonder drug because the effects are so marked, and it's not just in skeletal muscle.
Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone. In this week's episode, Steve Harridge joins us to talk about how exercise can slow our decline as we age. The topic is very broad, and so the conversation leads us everywhere from the International Space Station to discussing anabolic steroids, and finally how medical doctors lack a good understanding of training and exercise. Steve is a professor of applied physiology at King's College London, and we talk a lot about his research looking at older cyclists and how they compare to the sedentary population. And I thought this study was really useful for talking about some of the wider principles which underpin the work that Steve has done. Anyway, without further ado, we hope you enjoy the episode. Professor Harridge, thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to speak a bit about skeletal muscle and the benefits of exercise on aging and a whole host of different aspects of human health. I suppose what's interesting about exercise in particular is that there are quite well-characterized aspects of health which exercise contributes to, but we're also discovering all these new ways in which exercise is beneficial to us. Mm-hmm. So would you mind talking to us a bit about sort of what brought you to thinking about the effects of exercise and the research that you're interested in and doing?
Thank you. It's great pleasure to be here. Well, actually, my origins of being interested in exercise started from my own personal exercise. I used to be a 400-metre hurdler as a youngster, as a junior athlete. So I became interested in the physiology of adaptation to exercise, to fatigue. So that's really what sparked my interest, my own particular experiences of running quite a painful athletic event. And over time, and in a sense through my research career, I've always been interested in aging and kind of changes that occur as we get older and the impact that has on whole body function.
And I suppose also 400-metre hurdling sounds like a pretty brutal event. I think if I had to run that more than once, I'd start thinking about ways to optimise my performance.
I haven't done it for a number of years.
Yeah. I always hear about it as the anaerobic event that shouldn't be an anaerobic event.
It is quite a painful anaerobic event.
So I suppose that brings us on quite nicely to thinking about ageing and its effects on skeletal muscle. So what are the effects of ageing on skeletal muscle?
That is actually a killer question, and it's not nearly as easy to answer as you might think, because we have a view of ageing in terms of a societal view of ageing. But if you go back to our evolutionary biology and what our systems were designed for and what muscle was designed for, muscle is exquisitely sensitive to mechanical signals, to metabolic signals. So disentangling the effects of ageing from those effects which come from a lack of usage mechanically and metabolically is really difficult. So when we consider what's the typical older muscle, well, the typical older muscle is smaller in size. We have less of a tissue mass. It's weaker. It produces less force. It can generate less power, with the implications for function, which as an older person who may trip, stumble, have a fall, there are lots of contributory factors, but a loss of muscle mass and function is one of those. The ability to get out of a chair relates to a loss of muscle mass and function. So the muscle is weaker. The mechanisms that drive that process are still quite unclear. Anatomically, when we look at an older muscle, it has a reduced number of muscle fibers. So muscle fibers are controlled by the central nervous system through a motor unit. So a motor nerve and the fibers that nerve innervates are a motor unit. We have a reduction in those. The fast contracting, the type 2 fibers, the fast twitch fibers, these tend to atrophy or get smaller more selectively. That has an impact on power generation. And you get an infiltration of fat and connective tissue. So you've not only just got a loss of mass and size, you've actually got a loss of quality in the typical older muscle. And that has implications for function in the sense that in the main, our body mass stays pretty much the same. but you may lose 50% of your muscle mass. So simple things like rising from a chair are proportionately harder because you're working against the same load, but have maybe 50% less of a muscle when you're very old to do that. So these are all things that are sort of tied up in the functional consequences of aging muscle. But if we describe that typical older muscle, as I said a little earlier, if you then consider that most people are doing insufficient physical activity, many older people are not eating as well. If you remove these confounding factors and study people who are still very active and who still eat well and don't smoke and so on and so forth, their muscles are not nearly as bad as that. We don't see that decline in quality. We see really high functioning muscle. So when we attribute these changes in older people to an aging process, of course there is an aging process, but also there is an aging interacting with inactivity process. And when you remove the inactivity and you're just left with the aging, things aren't nearly as bad.
I suppose some of your work has used an interesting group of kind of older athletes to kind of disentangle this relationship between changes in usage and the functional changes as we age.
Yes, we have. We've done quite a large study on a group of master cyclists. Interestingly, there is a competitive world of athletes out there in masters competitions. This could be swimming, cycling, athletics. People who are still competing into very late life. Interestingly, when we look at the world record performances that have ever been, the best times ever recorded for 100 metres on the track or 10,000 metres on the track, you see this progressive decline in time. So these are the best people. They're training as hard as they can. So you're left, this is an aging effect that we're looking at here. Interestingly, there's a break point that occurs in your mid-70s, roughly, where the deterioration suddenly accelerates and you get a lot worse, which is a very interesting phenomenon. That occurs in all the records that you look at, whether it be sprinting, long-distance running, cycling or swimming. So there's no denying there's an aging process, even in the best case scenario. What we studied was a group of individuals who weren't elite athletes, but were amateur road cyclists, so they did a lot of cycling, but they weren't elite athletes. So now we're left with an aging signal alone. And when we did that, function still declined with age, that's for sure. Some less than we thought, but when you compare the data to data sets of sedentary individuals, then the cyclists were far superior in their physiology. The sort of cardiorespiratory fitness of an 80-year-old cyclist would be roughly that of someone of a 55-year-old or even younger sedentary person.
That's an incredible difference, isn't it?
It's a huge difference, and there's two ways of looking at that. One way is to say, isn't it amazing that these master or these cyclists are so much better? Or the alternative view is actually, how bad are the sedentary young? But from a societal perspective, and particularly in the medical perspective, we think of geriatric medicine and so on, the immediate thought is there's going to be an intervention, it's going to be exercise. Whereas the intervention for our cyclists would be to make them sedentary. It would be a negative intervention.
And to what extent does it matter when people have started this exercise? Because I presume if you are a competitive cyclist in your old age, you've probably been quite active, or you're likely to have been quite active in your youth as well, and continuing throughout. Can you put people on training regimes when they're a bit older and see improvements here?
It's a very interesting question. So the answer is probably not, in terms of the extent. They're very difficult experiments to actually do to provide the robust data, and we know that even very frail older people will respond and adapt positively to exercise training regimens. That's not to say that they all respond and adapt in the same way or to the same extent as when they're younger. That's not the same question, and it opens up a whole series of other questions. But at any age and at any level of physical ability, really. Now, it may be for a very old and quite frail person, that is, in absolute terms, not a lot of exercise. But in relative terms, it might be quite a lot.
I guess this all asks the question, are different forms of exercise different in their effects as we age?
Well, different types of exercise are different at any age. So if you take the two extremes of exercise, if you want to, for example, make muscles bigger and stronger, then the way to do that is not by jogging. The way to do that is to go to the gym and you lift heavy weights. And those mechanical signals stimulate the muscle to increase rates of muscle protein synthesis, which combined with appropriate feeding will in time make you grow muscle and you'll become stronger. That it's responding to that mechanical overload. If on the other hand you're wanting to have greater endurance and you do want to compete in next year's London Marathon, then you're not going to go to the gym and lift weights. You're going to be undertaking aerobic exercise, which is challenging the muscle metabolically. So you're stimulating more mitochondria, mitochondrial biogenesis. You're stimulating the growth of new capillaries, angiogenesis at the local level, as well as having adaptation centrally in the heart, where you'll increase left ventricular volume, for example, have a larger cardiac output. So the differences are very different. You know, those are the two ends of the spectrum. Of course, most people do exercise, which is a bit of both.
So this is, I think this touches on one of the things I wanted to discuss, which is, you know, for people who like to exercise and are thinking about the effects it has on their aging, what really is the optimum training regime in terms of mixing potentially more cardiovascular forms of training with strength training? And of course, within strength training, you can sort of train to failure, or you can do more high frequency and less intense sessions of training. For most people, what is the most effective routine? And are there people who are outliers and respond better to different routines?
When you find the answer to all those questions, please come and tell me. Now, to answer your question more broadly about aging, what should one do if you are, for instance, I just want to be healthy and I want to be active and I want to have a reasonable amount of strength? Should I focus on one thing or the other? The general piece of advice is do a range of activities that you enjoy. So, for example, cycling is a fantastic exercise for the cardiorespiratory system. It's good for muscle. It's good for the immune system, as we've also shown. But what it's not great for is bone. We identified a number of women in our study who were osteoporotic, even though they were highly fit. So that's a kind of exercise that's not targeting healthy bone. So you'd want to add some other type of exercise which has a slightly different, more mechanical loading component, like resistance exercise, or maybe a little bit of running. It's a real mix of things that you'd want to do. Now, for many older people who have muscle weakness, they may not be able to effectively do other types of exercise because their muscles are not allowing them to do that, in which case you would really want to target, certainly initially, muscle strengthening exercise to allow them to do other types of exercise.
I see. So I suppose the common thread through what we're saying is different kinds of exercise are good for promoting different kinds of health in old age. But in old age, perhaps developing strength as a first principle is most valuable.
Yeah, that's certainly very reasonable. We have this term anabolic resistance in old age. So studies have shown that your muscles are less sensitive to the signals, so the mechanical signals of exercise, the nutritional signals of feeding and responding to protein are blunted. They're not nearly as effective as when you are younger. That's not to say you're still not going to get benefits, and there is currently no drug, no pharmaceutical, which has the equivalent effect of a training program on skeletal muscle.
I might ask, when we're talking about kind of younger and older, when does this decline actually start, would you say?
So there's lots of factors that go into determining that, and it's very difficult to say, by age X, you're suddenly going to drop off. It's a progressive thing. But what we should also be aware of, that many times we tend to consider you're going to lose something at a certain percentage each year, for example. It's almost a linear, it's a straight line decline, when it's clearly not going to be a straight line decline. So it's very difficult, and people will be different. We know from our study on the cyclists, and of course many other areas of research, people are very different. Our cyclists, all doing the same thing, there'd be people who have a very similar level of cardiorespiratory fitness, which are VO2 max, and would differ in age between 55 and 73 for the same level of function. because they're naturally different anyway, as humans are. That's one of the problems with human studies, is that we have a great deal of genetic variability.
And this has sort of struck upon something I'd like to come back to in a bit, which is that my understanding is that amongst sort of sedentary men in our society, testosterone levels really collapse in your mid-40s. And so I'm interested that you'd say that performance declines more steadily. And so I wonder what the relationship is between the presence of anabolic hormones in the blood and the decrease in performance and muscle strength and health.
Well, there is certainly a relationship between those things, although it's complex, again. For example, we know that the growth hormone and IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1 axis, is extremely important during growth and development. And the IGF-1 levels fall, from early 20s. And many older individuals might be classified as being growth hormone deficient. Testosterone also falls, perhaps not quite as markedly as the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. So there's an interplay between these anabolic hormones. And there are studies have shown, for example, we know that testosterone is highly anabolic in young people when you give it at pharmaceutical concentrations. Likewise, if you block the effects of testosterone and put a young person through a training program, the anabolic effects become more muted. So we know that there's effect when you do that pharmacologically. But some very interesting studies from Canada show that when you physiologically create a high hormonal environment, which you can do naturally by exercise stimulates IGF-1 and growth hormone and testosterone. So you exercise before starting your training session, if that makes sense, to elevate your anabolic hormones, and then train the muscle to grow. It doesn't grow any more than it would without that high hormonal environment. So it's quite a complex interplay. We know pharmaceuticals can target that, and testosterone, the anabolic steroids, are clearly highly anabolic. So why don't we just give all old people anabolic steroids then? But of course,
this is something that people talk about.
Yeah,
testosterone replacement therapy.
Because there are dangers. Obviously, when we, for example, in males treat prostate cancer, we're looking at actually reducing the effects of testosterone. So enhancing testosterone is potentially very carcinogenic. So you have to be very careful. We have the same thing if we go, for example, on the International Space Station. So space flight is viewed as an accelerated model of aging in some respects, because your bones become more brittle, you lose muscle, your immune function declines. It looks like you're getting older.
Indeed, there are special exercises for people to do in the International Space Station.
Exactly. There is no special pill that the astronauts are taking. What they're taking is a 2 hours every day mandated exercise program, and obviously they have really targeted high quality nutrition as well, but it's the exercise program that's looking to mitigate the effects of unloading and disuse. And so we're back to the question of aging again. It's not really a model of accelerated aging, it's a model of frailty probably, because when we look at the aging model, which should be in exercises, then we have a different pattern emerging.
Although it's one thing prescribing kind of highly trained astronauts a 2-hour exercise program, but we've had a lot of, even as the benefits of exercise for cardiovascular health have been known for quite a long time, we have a lot of trouble convincing people to stay active, especially as jobs become more sedentary, housework becomes more sedentary. Is there kind of any scope, almost from a public health perspective, of improving on this?
You're correct. And of course, the worldwide experiment that's currently being undertaken is if you give vast swathes of the population plenty to eat and remove the need for them to be physically active, what happens? Well, you create epidemics of type 2 diabetes and obesity and cardiovascular disease.
Natural experiment.
Exactly. And we're back to we weren't designed to do those things. That's the problem. And I think it's a really important message to get across. I think Dame Sally Davies, who was the chief medical officer, said, something along the lines of, if exercise is being sold as a pill, it will be hailed as a wonder drug because the effects are so marked. And it's not just in skeletal muscle, it's across systems that exercise is benefiting. And of course, what in a sense, the pharmaceutical companies are trying to do is identify the pathways and the targets to develop pharmaceuticals to target these processes, which leads you to the point, well, why would we need to do that then if you can do it for free and naturally and physiologically, which of course you can. Now, that's not to say there are not instances where, for example, in critical illness and you're lying in an intensive care bed and losing muscle, you don't want a strategy, pharmacological or not, that's going to help you try and maintain the muscle that you're losing.
So would it be naive to say, we've heard about all these pathways that can be affected by exercise, would it be naive to say that we could reverse engineer them and actually almost go beyond what exercise is doing to them, and perhaps just pick out one? So say maybe this, if we increase this pathway by 50%, then we can avoid the negative effects of over increasing another pathway at the same time as this.
Well, that's a very complex thing, because all the pathways talk to one another in some level. Just to give you an example, if you undertake a strength training program, so you go to the gym, you haven't done strengthening exercise before, and you start lifting some heavy weights, you will rapidly become stronger. So you may increase by 200% in 12 or 16 weeks the amount that weight you can lift. Your muscle may grow by 10%. So where does that other gain in function come from? Which is half of the battle. It's not just about making the muscle bigger. So you have a pharmaceutical which targets muscle growth. Okay, but what about the activation and the neural pathways controlling that muscle? They are really, really important.
So just to make sure I fully understand what we've said, one of the things we've picked out is whether pharmaceutical interventions could have some of the positive effects which exercise can have on the body. And I think what you're saying is that the component which that approach would lack is the nervous adaptation, which is actually to keep muscles functional as well as maintain their size. You have to actually be firing the nerves to those muscles. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's essentially it. Because what you're dealing with is integrative physiology. We use athletic performance as examples, and they're good performance examples both for young people to understand about integrative physiology, but also in aging. So, for example, one of the clinical trial outcome measures will be, for example, a 6-minute walk test or a get up and go test. These are functional integrative tasks that require cognitive function, cardiovascular, respiratory, neuromuscular integration for them all to work.
In other words, it's complicated.
Have I said that word before?
Yeah.
I think this all kind of looks to a really kind of important idea in medicine, that we're not necessarily looking for kind of a change in a protein in someone's blood as the actual kind of end goal of our intervention. We're looking for kind of integrated benefits, as you said, being able to walk for 6 minutes, for example, that actually really make a difference for people's lives.
Still, in medical education, there is a generally poor understanding about exercise physiology, physical activity. Doctors are generally not well educated about its importance. That is changing slowly, but traditionally, someone goes to a doctor and expects to receive a pill of some description, and the doctor will prescribe a pill. It's much more complicated and time-consuming to sit down and go through someone's lifestyle and their diet and think about recommending things that are going to change their physical activity pattern and so on. But as we've said, going back to the comment by Dame Sally Davies, if exercise was prescribed as a pill, and it is in some instances, it would be hailed as this wonder drug.
Do you think if doctors had a better understanding of exercise and its beneficial effects, that would go a long way to improving preventative medicine in this country?
Yes, but I think it starts before that. There's a quote I heard recently along the lines of, exercise is not medicine, it's more important than that, on the basis that we shouldn't be relying on our doctors for our general health. This should be something that becomes a culturally accepted understanding from very young, when you're a very, very young child, that being physically active is good and you're eating well is good, and we should be educated and culturally
inducted.
It should be part of our culture that's the norm. Not being sedentary is not the norm.
And indeed waiting for things to go wrong to actually intervene in the system.
Well, Professor Harridge, you've certainly convinced me. I think I'm going to throw out my medical textbooks when I get home. I think we've about run out of time.
I think, so in summary, the ways in which exercise can help us are very complicated, but quite simple thing is that exercise does help us as we age.
Professor Harridge, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.